All right, let's talk about the Nikon ZR some more. Let's get a little bit deeper this time. Let's compare it to my Red Monstro. Let's put it in a real lighting scenario and actually test this camera and see what it's made of. And now I'm just gonna get right to the point here. This is no Red Monstro, but it is still a very fascinating little camera and it doesn't cost any money. And that is the selling point here. This is an incredible camera. This is a wild little camera, and for $2,200, you can't complain about anything that is in this camera. We already talked about a lot of its downfalls in the last video, but I will talk about a few more things that I figured out with this camera and just really where I land on this overall at this point. So am I gonna sell my Red Monstro and my Red Komodo and just buy two of these? Because Philip Bloom thinks I'm going to. And we wouldn't want to disappoint him now, would we? So what I want to get out of the way immediately is the dynamic range talk. I mean, I mentioned it in my last video that according to the test, yes, the test, the people don't like the tests. Don't let the test dictate my purchasing decisions. I did my own test. Nothing scientific. Other people have done these tests already, but I had to do them myself. I had to do them in a way that felt right for me, how I would use the camera, what I think about them, and sometimes I don't trust how these tests are done. So I did a quick window dynamic range test. You've seen this one before. Basically, you put your subject right next to a window, you expose for the window, and you see what those shadows are doing inside. So actually, we had blacked out a lot of the other light in this room. There was a little bit of fill light, but nothing crazy. It definitely was exposed for the outside, and it was definitely dark where my subject was sitting. Now, what I did here is I did this side by side with the Monstro. And I think what's important here when we're talking about dynamic range, and the problem that gets a little complicated when talking about dynamic range is usable stops versus noise reduced stops. Now, if you know me, I don't like noise reduction. If I have to apply noise reduction in post, I shot it wrong. That's how I look at it. That's okay. Some people are in scenarios where you have to underexpose and you save it with noise reduction, but noise reduction is not a part of my workflow. I've always shot on Red cameras because I want to shoot raw and I want to expose the image correctly and get the most textured in an image with the most color fidelity as I can. That's why I haven't ever gone with the Sony FX3 route because, they're doing noise reduction in camera to get those extra dynamic range stops. Does it work? It totally works. And that's okay. That's just not my preference and not what I've done with my kit. And I have no intention of changing that now. First off, the Nikon ZR, if it does end up in my kit, is not going to be my A camera, but I want to see if it can have the ability to be the A camera depending on the shoot and what are its full capabilities in that environment. What are my limitations with it as a camera? Side by side with the Monstro, we've got the Thypoch cinema lenses on there, the M-mount lenses, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. I've got this nice little Thypoch positive locking M-mount on the Nikon ZR, which is really nice. We'll talk about that later. But exposing for the window here, I put both of them at T11 and then I went down to T16. So at 800 ISO with a Rec 709 on them, they look basically the same. Right? Which, okay, good. So then you think, well, the dynamic range doesn't really matter then, right? Rec 709. So this is the practical scenario that we're talking about. So where it differs from the Monstro in this scenario is that the Monstro, native, if you want to say that the Red camera even has a native ISO, would be 1600, right? So if you push both of them to 1600, the Nikon ZR shadows get extremely noisy. So we're talking about just pushing it up another full ISO stop. I mean, you could, if you want to call it that, obliterating the shadows with noise, right? So in a practical scenario, are you doing this? Probably not. You're probably not doing this. You're probably lighting it. And if you've followed me for a long time, I like to test cameras in lit scenarios. I don't like to test cameras in non-lit scenarios to begin with. But I just wanted to get this clear. This camera does not have a lot of dynamic range. It has a totally acceptable amount of dynamic range. And I actually shooting with it extensively yesterday, I didn't find it to ever be limiting me, which when I have shot on other cameras, it has limited me. Now, you do need to properly expose this camera. So if you're thinking about an Arri Alexa or the high-end cameras, the reason the dynamic range is so nice in those cameras is because you don't have to nail the exposure. You would think on a big budget set you're going to nail the exposure. Of course, it just gives you this amazing ability to finesse things and not have to stress so much. But when you're shooting on a lower end sensor like this, you're going to have to do that. If you slightly underexpose the sensor, just slightly underexpose it, it's going to look really noisy. I'm just letting you know this right now. And why I say this too is because there's not really great exposure tools on this, and the waveforms on the back are really tiny, and you sort of know when you're clipping, you sort of don't. So this really needs an external monitor or a firmware update to give you better exposure tools, because the only time I ever kind of messed things up is when I couldn't pay attention to those waveforms and they weren't really where I thought they were. This only happened like once, so it's no big deal. I was paying a lot of attention to it, but you can't underexpose this thing. This isn't going to give you any favors in the red raw territory if you even underexpose it by a stop. If anything, err on the higher side of exposure when using this camera. That being said, when it is exposed properly, like most sensors, it's going to look really good. Side by side with the Monstro, in a dynamic range test, the Monstro destroys this camera. So you've probably seen some other tests online comparing to other Reds. Yes, they can match in a perfectly lit environment. This camera is going to very well match another Red camera all the way from the lowest end to the high end, which is an amazing thing. So I'm not crapping on the dynamic range here. It's really incredible that you can do that. The red raw in this camera and the image that's coming out of this camera is really nice. But this is not your run and gun FX3 shooter style camera. When you're shooting on red like that, you're going to see your noise because there's not noise reduction built in. It's just simple as that. Just want to kind of get that out of the way now. But using this camera in a well-lit, controlled environment, it performs very well. Shockingly well, I would say. It feels a lot like other red cameras. It really does. It feels like the curve is kind of where other Reds are at. Actually, if you shout out to Brandon Talbot that said this, but if you shoot with this and you feel like you want to go above 800 ISO, just switch over to the 6400 ISO gain and then bring it down later. And I agree with him totally on this. If I felt I had any reason to go above 800, I didn't, because if I needed to do that, that means I was pretty dark. And that means I'm underexposing this camera, and that means I'm going to get noise. And so I definitely agree with him switching to 6400 and then bringing it down later back to wherever you want it to be, 1200, 1600. That's going to give you a much better image. You will lose just a smidge, like any other dual gain camera, a little bit of highlight latitude, and I did test this on that window. There definitely is a highlight shift. It's not going to give you the same sliding dynamic range. It's going to be lower on the spectrum, which is totally fine. That is to be expected, and that's what we want. The thing that really interesting about this camera is what it's capable of for the size and price. The fact that it does 60 frames per second full frame red raw is incredible. The Monstro barely does that. Now, the Monstro does do that, but you'll have to change your compression ratio. And you're shooting 8K, and the sensor is bigger than this sensor, so there is a difference there. But this is still a full-frame sensor. This still performed really well with the Thypochs on it all day. It's just kind of incredible how tiny it is and what it can do. It seems like Nikon's trying to come for Sony here, for sure. Now, on all these tests that I did, I tried to just use the camera like this. In my hand, manual focus. I wanted to see if it would give me confidence using it that way. And basically what I can say, I just kept it on the standard in-body stabilization on it. I didn't want to do sport mode or anything like that because I didn't want it to get jerky. I've seen some tests online that sometimes the IBIS might just jerk the sensor when you don't want it to, which kind of screws some stuff up. I hope that's a firmware update or something that can be fixed. There's a couple of those floating around online right now. I don't know. I haven't had it happen to me yet, so I can't speak to it too much. So I was going to talk a little bit about the IBIS on this camera, but I'm realizing now that when I took off my autofocus lens, I didn't reprogram the manual focus lens that I had in here. And you have to tell it what lens you have on it for what they're calling vibration reduction, which is the IBIS, to work. So that's definitely why all my footage had a little bit of micro jitters to it, is because I didn't actually switch that setting over. See, so when you do have a manual focus lens on here, you are going to have to program it and tell it what focal length you are at in order to get better vibration control from it. So really what I wanted to test here was using the camera in this kind of small form factor, like this kind of compact setup. Obviously no cage on it or anything like that, with just the tiny little Thypoch lenses, which really lend to this setup, everything being so small, especially when I'm used to my big cinema cameras, rigged out, 15 pounds. Whereas this one I want to see as a B or C camera, could I use it just like this with the IBIS and still get some decent B-roll? This is working pretty well, especially now that I've actually programmed this lens into the camera. You know, you can set your manual focus lens in the IBIS. This one's a 35mm, so I programmed that into the camera, and now the IBIS seems to be working pretty well. thing you could do in this setup is use something like a shoot sack, cine saddle. This is called a bebop, and then just put your arms on there and be really stable with that IBIS. And really it's this 4-inch screen that makes this all work. Without this 4-inch screen, you just really would want another monitor to really be able to see the image, but the 4-inch screen is kind of like what makes this whole setup work this way. You could just do this and have a really stable shot. So spoiler, I am definitely going to add this to my kit, fully add this to my kit. And I probably will kit it out a little bit. You know, I need to do something to it, a cage, maybe a monitor, just to give it a little bit of weight and a little bit more exposure controls on it. That's really where I'm leaning to with this camera currently. The battery lasting 2 hours in such a small little body is really interesting to me. You don't have to add more batteries to it, adding more weight and more bulk. I think that is just a fun thing about this, but I do need a little bit more weight on it to get rid of those micro jitters, of course. So everything in here is lit. In this environment, it was quite dark. In order to expose the TVs and expose my subject here, I did eventually put on an ND filter, but the moment I put on the ND filter, the shadows started to get noisy. And this, I'm talking one stop. It only takes one stop to really, really underexpose this camera. There's not a lot of wiggle room there, and especially compared to the Monstro. If you see these side-by-side tests with the Monstro, you can push and pull that Monstro all day, and it's clean. So clean, and that's why you're paid for something like that. You're obviously going to get all the cinema I/O in the Monstro compared to something like this. This really is a B or C camera. It could totally be done as an A camera. If you are just getting started, this is one of the coolest starter cameras you can buy next to a Blackmagic Pocket or something like that. Very fun. So especially if you're into the Red ecosystem, if you already like the Red raw workflow, if you like the color science of Red, this is going to give you all of that. It really does. If it doesn't even look better than the Komodo at times, outside of the noise, of course. It's very cool in that way. We went outside here. It's, you know, it's fall now, so the sun was at a really nice angle. We did walk around with a little 40-inch ultra bounce. I'm never using my cameras without a little bit of lighting, without a little bit of bounce. This is how I test things. And you can just see by the footage. I mean, I feel like it speaks for itself. It holds up. It looks really good. I feel like I have a lot of confidence in this sensor as of right now. I don't have any qualms with this sensor. I'm definitely going to be adding it to my kit. I'll be selling this camera, probably my little Lumix here. Love this little camera, but it'll probably be going away and being replaced by this guy here really soon. The 60 frames per second looks really nice. I didn't see any issues with the 60 FPS. The thing I didn't like coming from other Reds and real cinema cameras is the 24 frames per second time base. That's not something that happens on this camera. You have to conform your footage back to 2398 from 5994. It doesn't do it automatically, right? You can't just set this thing to 24 frames and then get that in your Red RAW. So if you're coming from a cinema camera, that's something that this camera does not do. So that's unfortunate, but not the end of the world, of course. And also, this doesn't do 24 flat. It does 2398. I know that's a limitation of some mirrorless cameras. I know it took forever for Sony to get that. It took Sony forever to get the shutter angle. This actually has shutter angle already on it, so you don't have to worry about that. So that's still convenient. So if you do switch over to 5994, you're still going to get a 180-degree shutter without having to change any settings, which is nice. This might be nothing, maybe it's just a user error, but something I did notice when you throw it into DaVinci Resolve and you want to play with the RAW settings, it's just going to automatically place your footage at 320 ISO. So if you shot at 800, when you load it in, remember that you might have to go back and rechange where your ISO is at. It's a Red camera, so it's still not clipped. It's not really going to change the dynamic range necessarily, just like practically speaking, so you could still use it at 320 and play with it in that realm. I don't ever do this. I mean, I think it's kind of nice. It kind of reminds you where you're at on your ISO and you can change that, but it's just not going to natively import the same way you would think an R3D would normally import. It kind of does its own thing. But once I kind of figured out the waveform, how things were performing on that, I didn't use an external monitor or anything the whole time. I just pulled focus by hand. I found the camera to be working as well as I would want it to, honestly. I never overexposed by accident. If anything, I would underexpose. And if I did do that, I would introduce a little bit of noise. The noise doesn't look bad with a nice Rec 709 on it, but if you try to push and pull that at all, you're going to start seeing that noise. And you can see all this footage here was shot with the Thypoch lenses. I really wanted to test out that combo. I own the Thypochs. I love the Thypochs. You know, I've talked about them plenty on the channel before, and I really like how the Thypochs sit with this camera, and especially with these new mounts. So these new mounts really lock it into place. The M mount is not a common mount, but the M mount is nice because you can use it on multiple cameras with adapters. And now Thypoch makes their own adapters for this. And there's a double locking PL. It actually has the PL, but then it has this other safety lock on it. So you really know that your lens is secure on there, and you just have to flip that switch before you unlock it, and then you can pull that out, and it just gives you a lot of confidence when using these lenses. Now, rather than having to use a little twist on lock adapter and getting wiggle and play, this is going to get rid of all that, which is really nice. And I actually want to shout out Thypoch for sponsoring this video. Collaborating with Thypoch is a no-brainer for me. I love their cinema lenses. I've been using them on so many projects. And really what I love is how tiny the Thypoch Simera-C cinema lenses are, especially in this little form factor on this little camera. So like pairing these together is a really nice setup. And so if you're in the market for some lenses, Thypoch actually has a bunch of Black Friday deals going on. First off, if you just buy their lens set, the Simera-C lens set from their website, you're actually gonna be able to get a $720 discount buying it straight from the website. And also because they're a sister company of DZO, if you purchase the 5 lens set of the Simera-C's E-mount, by adding only $500, you can receive one Cata Zoom, the DZO Cata Zoom, the 70-135 E-mount lens for free. Also, if you purchase the Simera-C 5 lens M-mount set, you can also get one of their Cata Zoom lenses and then just get whatever mount you want. You can get the 70-135 with an E, RF, Z, or L mount for $500 plus 30% off the lens adapter. And then you can choose any of the lens adapters as well, the RF, the E, the Z, and the L. So if you're interested in a little setup like this and you want the Thypochs and you want to put them on your Nikon ZR once you get that, or whatever camera works for you, Thypoch has those deals going on starting November 11th. So thank you Thypoch for sponsoring this video. When I'm sitting here looking at the timeline, I'm using the same color grade on the Monstro and Nikon ZR, and if you're just scrolling through and clicking around, you can't tell the difference. So in a properly lit scenario with your exposure done correctly, with the same color grade, I can't tell the difference between the Monstro and the Nikon ZR. And that's just a remarkable thing, everyone. This camera is not overhyped. If you're coming from the FX3, you might feel that way a little bit because FX3 has just been so good to so many people, and that sensor in the FX6, etc. If you just really wanted that red raw, if you just wanted that little extra punch and that little bit of extra control, this is going to give that to you. So, I mean, I'm really curious what the second version of this camera is. I'm really curious what Nikon is going to do next. If they're going to put this sensor in a bigger body with maybe red IO on it, if they're going to have it a little bit cheaper than the other, like a red Komodo. I mean, this sensor in a red Komodo would be really cool. It would take away some of the cool things I like about this camera. Like, I don't usually love mirrorless bodies, but the fact that this is so tiny would be cool. It's just really interesting. If they can make this just a tiny cube, but have all these same features and give me STI, give me full HDMI, and really those red menus, the red menus would do so much for this camera. But if you just want a good sensor with autofocus, 60 frames per second, all those goodies, and a million different codecs and 32-bit flow audio, this is it. I mean, it's here. It feels decent in the hand because it is so tall, but it really does kind of like scream for a hand grip and a cage to really get this thing a little bit more weight on it and really get it usable in a way that you could use it as like your A camera or even like a B camera for B-roll or something like that. But you know me, I've stuck with my cinema cameras for a very long time now. I've never been a big mirrorless shooter, but this is the one. This is the mirrorless that now is going to be part of my kit for sure. They got me. Nikon convinced me to get excited about a mirrorless camera again. Good for you. Buying red must have been the right decision. This is priced so well, people. $2,200 is an insane price for what this camera can do. Don't love the menus, but the big screen is helpful. I did run around the whole time just using this screen, and I didn't feel like I needed focus peaking or anything. A couple times I missed focus, but for the most part, I could really see a lot on the screen. It's something I really didn't know I needed, but the big screen is a big plus.